The darkness of the night cloaked the mansion in silence, but what I saw with my own eyes shattered every sense of normalcy I had ever known. A beautiful young woman, my employer's daughter, or so I had thought, was not sneaking out to meet a boy as one might expect. Instead, she was moving quietly toward the stable alone and with a secrecy that made the scene all the more unsettling. For as long as I'd worked there, I had believed that Maria had no interest in horses or the stable. She never spoke of them, never visited them, never even acknowledged their presence on the estate. But that night, as she slipped into the stable under the cover of darkness, I was proven completely wrong. My curiosity overwhelmed me. I followed her silently, keeping a safe distance so she wouldn't notice. She moved straight toward the most beautiful white Arabian horse in the stable. Gently, almost lovingly, she touched the horse's back and then leaned forward to kiss it. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was witnessing. Then, in the still silence, she removed a rope from her coat pocket and carefully tied the horse's legs together. What was even stranger, the horse didn't resist. It stood calmly as though this was not the first time. I was still trying to process this bizarre scene when things took a darker turn. She knelt between the horse's legs and began removing her own clothes. My heart began to race, not out of desire, but out of sheer disbelief and horror. Her actions were beyond comprehension, and I felt an overwhelming urge to vomit. She remained there for nearly 2 hours. When she finally stood up, dressed again, and returned to the mansion, I quietly retreated to my small servant's quarters. I did not sleep that night. The image of her behavior haunted me. The next morning, as I returned to the mansion for my daily duties, I could not help but stare at her. She sat calmly at the breakfast table, sipping tea like nothing had happened. Her face was serene, almost angelic. Nothing about her appearance gave away the horror I had witnessed. It baffled me how someone could appear so normal after committing such an unfathomable act. She ordered me to clean her room as usual before leaving for college, and I obeyed, though my mind was anything but calm. After Maria left for college, I walked into her room with a sense of unease. My hands moved automatically, picking up scattered items and dusting shelves, but my mind was focused on the night before. As I stepped into the bathroom to clean, I noticed something unusual, a set of clothes hanging neatly on a hook. They were the same clothes Maria had worn the previous night. A dampness lingered on the fabric and an unmistakable odor wafted from them, the strong, pungent scent of horses. It wasn't the mild smell of someone who had simply visited a stable. No, this was the deeply absorbed, raw stench of filth, unmistakably from the stables. My suspicion hardened into certainty. She hadn't merely walked into the stable, she had spent time in direct contact with the animals and their surroundings. Why would someone with all the luxury in the world do something so degrading, so revolting? Maria had money, comfort, a life most people only dream of. What was she lacking that pushed her into this bizarre habit? Was it loneliness? Was it something deeper, something twisted inside her soul? Over the next few days, I became more observant, trying to make sense of Maria's behavior. During the day, she was perfectly normal. She smiled when needed, gave orders politely, and rarely spoke beyond necessary instructions. But at night, she became someone else, a stranger performing rituals in the dark, hidden from the world. Determined to understand, I began observing her routine more closely. On the second night, I deliberately stayed back, pretending to retire to my quarters while secretly hiding near the rear of the mansion. Around midnight, I spotted her slipping quietly from the back door, wrapped in her coat, moving toward the stables just as before. This time, I was already inside, hidden behind a stack of hay. I watched as she repeated the same process, tying the horse's legs, removing her clothes, and then engaging in the same disturbing behavior. But tonight, something about her seemed even more intense. She was no longer just going through a routine. She was immersed in it, her body trembling with a strange, wild energy. That's when something inside me snapped. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. I stepped out of hiding and walked toward her. The moment she saw me, she froze, and her face turned pale with shock. She shouted angrily, asking what I was doing there. But I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed her gently yet firmly by the arms and pulled her away from the horse. Maria resisted at first, shouting in disbelief, but her voice was weak, like someone caught doing something unspeakable and now unsure how to explain it. I didn't respond to her questions or accusations. Without uttering a word, I led her out of the stable and into my modest servant's quarter at the far end of the estate. She stumbled slightly as I brought her inside and sat her down on the edge of my bed. She looked bewildered, her breath short, her hair disheveled. A mixture of embarrassment, fury, and confusion painted her face. For a moment, there was silence. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "Why are you doing this?" I wanted to yell, to question her, to shake some clarity into the situation, but all I managed to say was, "Why were you there? What were you doing?" She didn't reply. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her lips pressed tightly together. It was clear she wasn't ready to talk, so I waited. I stayed awake all night, seated on a stool next to the bed, watching her silently, trying to make sense of everything. Maria didn't try to escape. She lay on the bed, her back to me, unmoving. She wasn't asleep, but she wasn't present either, just breathing steadily in the dim light, her expression unreadable. Every now and then, I would hear a quiet sniffle. She was crying silently, trying to hide her pain, as if ashamed of both her actions and her vulnerability. Hours passed, and dawn began to break. A pale golden light crept through the tiny window of the quarter, stretching across the cracked floor and up the wooden bedpost. I turned to her and asked gently, "Please, just tell me why." That's when she finally moved. She sat up slowly, wrapping the bedsheet around her shoulders. Her voice came out rough and low. "He's not my father," she said. "He's my husband." Those words struck me like lightning. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, but she continued, her eyes locked onto mine, filled with exhaustion and sorrow. "I married him when I was 17, not for love, not for dreams, but because I had no choice. My mother was sick, my sisters had no one. He promised to help us. And he did. But I became his secret, his shame." She paused, inhaling shakily. "He already had a family, a wife, children. I live here alone. And when he's not here, I feel like nothing, like I don't exist at all." Maria's voice quivered, yet her words were as sharp as a blade. "He visits when he pleases, once or twice a week. Otherwise, I spend my days waiting in this mansion that feels more like a golden prison." She looked away, biting her lip to stop it from trembling. "He never took me anywhere. He never introduced me to anyone. I don't exist in his world. I'm just a secret locked away behind these walls." I listened, stunned. My mind struggled to process the weight of what she had revealed. This wasn't just about loneliness. This was about a life stolen from a girl who had sold her youth to save her family. "So the world sees him as an honorable man," she continued bitterly, "while I live like a ghost in a house filled with mirrors that don't reflect me." Her face hardened. "Do you know how it feels to see him post pictures with his first wife and children while I hide in shadows? Do you know what it's like to be unwanted by the man you married just to keep your mother alive?" I couldn't, but I could feel the anguish radiating from her like heat from a flame. "And the stable?" I asked carefully. "Why the horses? Why that?" She lowered her head, her fingers twisted into the bedsheet. "The first time it happened, I didn't plan it. I was crying, desperate, alone. I wandered outside and sat near the horses. Their warmth, their smell, it reminded me of something raw, something real. I don't know why I did what I did, but in that moment, I felt like someone else. I felt alive." I swallowed the sickness forming in my stomach, not because of judgment, but because it was heartbreaking. She was crying for help in the only way her broken mind could find. "I know it's wrong," she whispered. "I know I'm not well. But when he ignores me, when he takes his other family for Umrah, and I'm left behind without even a goodbye, it breaks me." Her tears fell freely now, soaking into the sheet she clutched like a lifeline. I reached out, gently placing my hand on hers. "You're not alone anymore," I said quietly. "But this isn't the way. You don't have to hurt yourself to feel something." She looked at me, eyes wide with pain but tinged with hope. For the first time, there was silence between us. Not heavy, not hollow, but the silence that follows truth. The room fell still after Maria's confessions. I sat beside her, unsure of what to say next. Nothing in my life had prepared me for a moment like this, where pain was not loud or violent, but quiet, aching, and persistent like a wound that refused to heal. Maria wiped her tears, her face pale but calm. "I didn't expect you to listen," she murmured. "I thought you'd be disgusted and leave." I shook my head gently. "It's not disgust, Maria. It's heartbreak. You've been carrying this burden alone for too long." Her lips trembled, then curled into a weak smile. "You're the first person I've told all this to." A long silence stretched between us, but this time it felt necessary. I sensed she needed time to breathe, to process. I didn't rush her. Eventually, she looked toward the small window. The morning sun had begun to touch the sky. She stood slowly and said, "I should go before the other servants wake up." "Wait," I said softly. "Before you go, let me say something." She turned to me, eyebrows slightly raised. "I'm not a saint, Maria. I'm just a man trying to do what's right." "But you need more than just someone who listens. You need healing, not from people like me, but from God, from your own heart." Her expression flickered, surprise, then hesitation. "Have you ever thought about trying to find peace through prayer?" I asked. "Not rituals, not obligation, just speaking to God like He's listening." "Because I believe He is." Her gaze fell. "I used to, before all of this. But after marrying him, I felt abandoned, like God forgot me too." "He didn't," I said firmly. "Sometimes the darkest valleys bring us closest to the light. You've lived in pain and secrecy, but maybe this is the moment your story changes." She looked at me for a long time, and for the first time since I had known her, she didn't seem burdened. Just tired, but not broken. "Will you pray with me?" she whispered, barely audible. I nodded. We sat on the floor side by side, and in that quiet room I recited simple prayers, words not grand but heartfelt. I saw her lips move slowly at first, then with growing courage. It was a beginning, a fragile light breaking into years of darkness. And though I didn't know where her journey would lead, I felt something shift in her. Hope had entered the room. In the days that followed our prayer, something in Maria began to change. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was subtle, like spring slowly thawing the cold edges of winter. She still moved through the house with the same grace, the same quiet demeanor, but her eyes, those sorrow-laden eyes, held a softness they never had before. I noticed her spending more time in the garden, sitting under the old neem tree with a small book in her lap. At first, I assumed it was a journal, but then I saw it. A small leather-bound Quran worn at the corners. She would sit there for hours, lips moving in silent recitation, her fingers gently tracing the script as though it was a lifeline. It amazed me, this silent transformation. Maria, who had once found comfort in the most degrading rituals, was now seeking peace in sacred words. The very act that once disgusted and disturbed me had now been replaced by something pure, something redemptive. We began to talk more, not about the past, but about the present. She asked me questions about faith, about inner peace, about how I had found strength through hardship. I told her everything, without pretense. How my arrival in the city had broken me, how rejection and humiliation had pushed me toward bitterness, until I had chosen to believe that my pain could serve a purpose. She listened like someone thirsty for answers. "Why didn't you take advantage of me that night?" she asked once, her voice trembling. I looked her in the eyes. "Because pain doesn't deserve more pain, Maria. It deserves healing. And in that moment, I saw your pain. I couldn't add to it." She blinked fast, then looked away. "I think I finally understand the difference between desire and dignity." As the days turned into weeks, her transformation deepened. The other servants noticed it too. She no longer snapped at them or walked with a veil of detachment. She had begun to smile, to greet them gently, to ask about their lives. It was as if she had rediscovered her own humanity and in doing so acknowledged theirs. But one truth remained unchanged. Her husband still came once a week, stayed briefly, and left without a word about their shared life. Maria never complained. She no longer begged for his love. She had stopped looking outward for validation. Her healing had come from within. And though her circumstances hadn't changed, Maria had. The darkness was still there, but she now carried her own light. Maria's transformation wasn't a secret for long. The other household staff began speaking in whispers, curious, surprised, even a little respectful. The same young woman who once wandered the halls like a silent ghost or locked herself away behind heavy wooden doors now walked with calm dignity and quiet strength. She still remained private, but she no longer radiated loneliness. Her conversations became thoughtful, her gaze more grounded. I noticed that she had begun keeping a small prayer mat in her room, and every day just before dawn she would wake up to pray. The sound of her soft weeping during those early hours no longer came from despair, but from a heart that was learning to feel safe again. One evening, as I brought her tea to the balcony, she looked at me and said, "Shehzad, do you believe a person can live in a palace and still feel homeless?" I paused, not knowing what to say. "I've lived in this house for years, but it never belonged to me," she said. "Not truly. Not until now." That sentence stayed with me. Perhaps healing wasn't about changing your surroundings. Perhaps it was about reclaiming your space, even in the same place where your heart had been broken. Maria also began writing again. I saw her at her desk, scribbling in old notebooks. She didn't hide it, and once she even handed me a page to read. It was a letter, never meant to be sent, to her younger self. In it, she apologized for every time she had ignored her own pain to meet someone else's expectations. She ended the letter with, "You are not ruined, you are just weathered." There were nights I still remembered the first time I had followed her into the stable, those disturbing images still trying to claw their way back into my thoughts. But now they faded quickly, replaced by this newer version of Maria, who had pulled herself out of that spiral without therapy, without support from family, just through reflection, prayer, and grit. She began asking about her mother and sisters again. Her husband had long refused to let her see them, citing convenience, control, or image. But Maria no longer feared him. "If I can reclaim my dignity in this house," she told me once, "then I can find my way back to my family too." Something in her voice carried quiet resolve. She was no longer waiting for someone to rescue her. Maria had found her strength, and it was only growing. Despite the calm that Maria projected outwardly, her life was far from easy. Her husband, the man she once called her savior, had grown distant again. He returned to the house less frequently, often citing work or family responsibilities with his first wife. But Maria no longer questioned his absences. She had stopped expecting warmth from someone who only offered obligation. One afternoon, as I was trimming the garden hedges, Maria approached me with an envelope. "I need you to mail this," she said, avoiding eye contact. It was addressed to her younger sister. I haven't written to her in years. I took the envelope silently, understanding its weight. That evening, I dropped it into the mailbox with a strange sense of hope. For Maria, reconnecting with her family wasn't just about a relationship. It was about recovering a part of herself that had been buried beneath years of silence and sacrifice. Days passed, and Maria seemed unusually anxious. She checked the mailbox herself, something she'd never done before. Then one evening, as the sun was setting behind the garden wall, a letter finally came in return. I saw her clutch it tightly, her hands trembling as she walked quickly to her room. She didn't speak to anyone that night, but her eyes were red the next morning, not with sorrow, but with relief. Her sister had written back. They remembered her. They still loved her. This small act of reconnection stirred something deep within her. She began speaking more often about her dreams, not just the broken ones, but new ones too. "I want to teach," she told me once. "Not in a school, but maybe just young girls who've forgotten how much they're worth." I listened quietly. Every word she spoke was laced with longing and strength. This was no longer the woman who escaped into darkness to soothe her pain with filth and tears. This was a woman finding purpose inch by inch. Her husband, however, noticed the change too, and he didn't like it. He began visiting more frequently, but not with affection. His tone turned sharp, his eyes suspicious. Maria stood her ground, polite yet distant. She no longer cowered beneath his presence. One night, I heard shouting from the main lounge. He was angry, accusing her of becoming proud, disobedient. too independent. Maria didn't yell back. She only said, "You gave me this silence. I just learned how to live in it without you." It was the first time I had ever heard her speak with such quiet defiance. The balance in the house was beginning to shift. Maria's words that night echoed through the walls long after her husband had stormed out. For the first time, she had stood up not just for herself, but for the version of her that had been silenced for years. I sensed that something permanent had shifted in her spirit. She wasn't the same woman who once wept in secret corners or wandered alone into the stable, seeking comfort in filth and madness. She was reclaiming herself. The next few days were quieter in the bungalow. Her husband didn't return immediately, and Maria spent her time in the garden, barefoot in the grass, trimming rose bushes, watering plants, and sometimes just sitting under the sun, eyes closed, breathing like someone learning how to live again. I often watched her from a distance. She didn't smile often, but there was a calmness in her now that hadn't existed before. She had found her footing. Then, unexpectedly, a religious speaker visited the neighborhood mosque. The event drew a large crowd, and Maria asked if I could arrange a small speaker system so she could listen from the house. She sat silently on the veranda that evening, listening to the words about patience, healing, and the strength that comes from forgiveness, both of others and oneself. After the speech, she called me to the garden. "I think I understand now," she said. "Pain is not something we erase. It's something we walk through, slowly, step by step, until we find ourselves on the other side." I nodded, unsure of what to say. She didn't need my advice anymore. She was already guiding herself. That night, she took a Quran from the shelf in the living room and brought it to her room. I later noticed a faint light under her door and the soft sound of recitation. She was teaching herself to read again, not just the words on the page, but the truths she had long forgotten. Over the next few weeks, she began journaling, keeping notes, and writing prayers. She requested books on mental well-being and religion. I ordered them for her online. Her room, once a silent prison, became a place of quiet reflection. One morning, she handed me an envelope again, this time addressed to her husband. "Don't worry," she said with a faint smile. "It's not anger, just clarity." Inside was a heartfelt letter, not to accuse, not to beg, but to declare that she was choosing to live for herself now, not for silence, not for sorrow, just peace. Weeks passed, and life within the bungalow settled into a new rhythm. Maria no longer moved like a shadow. Her steps had grown steadier, her eyes no longer darted toward doors in fear. She walked with purpose, even if that purpose was as simple as watering a plant or preparing a cup of tea for herself. There was dignity in her solitude now, not sorrow. One morning, just as the sun peeked over the horizon, her husband's car pulled into the driveway. I saw him pause before stepping out. There was hesitation in his movements, as if he knew things were no longer the same. He entered the bungalow without the usual arrogance. When he found Maria in the living room, seated calmly with a Quran in her lap, he stopped. "I got your letter," he said quietly. Maria looked up, her face serene. "I wasn't asking for permission," she replied gently. "I just wanted you to understand who I am now." He remained silent for a moment. Then he sat across from her, the way a stranger might when trying to understand a foreign world. "You've changed," he finally admitted. Maria nodded. "No, I just remembered who I was before I became yours." They spoke for a long time that morning, not as husband and wife in a traditional sense, but as two people bound by circumstance and complicated emotions. She told him about her pain, her loneliness, and her descent into darkness. He listened, not interrupting. Perhaps for the first time, he truly saw her. By the time their conversation ended, something unspoken had been agreed upon. He would continue supporting her financially, but Maria would no longer live as a forgotten possession hidden from the world. She would be allowed to travel, reconnect with her sisters, and build a life on her own terms, even if she chose to remain his wife legally. That evening, Maria came to me in the garden. "I'm going to visit my family next month," she said, her eyes soft. "I haven't seen my sisters in years." I smiled. "You deserve that and more." As she walked back inside, a breeze passed through the garden, swaying the flowers gently. The bungalow no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a beginning. Maria's journey had been cruel and strange, marked by unspeakable pain and secrets buried under shame. But in the end, she didn't break. She transformed. And I, the quiet servant who once watched from the shadows, was proud to witness the rebirth of a woman who had once forgotten how to live.